Keanu Reeves was driving in his car, rushing to an important meeting, when a sudden turn changed everything. On the side of the road, he saw an elderly woman with a small child in a wheelchair. Her eyes were full of pain, and his heart was determined to help. What did the actor, known for his kindness, do to change their lives forever? Watch to the end, because this story will amaze you. Keanu Reeves was driving through the city, his thoughts preoccupied with the upcoming charity event he was supposed to attend. The evening was meant to be a grand occasion, where prominent figures gathered to raise funds for various social causes. But as he moved along his usual route, he noticed a detour sign blocking his path. Roadwork. With a sigh, he turned onto an unfamiliar street, heading through a quieter, less fortunate part of town. The buildings were old and worn, with cracked facades and faded paint. Sidewalks were uneven, some parts crumbling away entirely. The people who walked these streets carried the weight of hardship in their eyes, moving with the quiet exhaustion that only years of struggle could bring. As Keanu drove past, something caught his attention. A frail, elderly woman crouched near a trash bin, picking through discarded bottles and cans. Beside her stood a battered baby stroller, its fabric torn and faded. Inside, a small child lay sleeping, bundled in a thin, worn blanket. Keanu felt his heart tighten. Something about the woman seemed eerily familiar, as if he had seen her before in a different life. Unable to shake the feeling, he slowed down and pulled over a few feet ahead. He stepped out of his car and approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her. The closer he got, the more he recognized the deep lines on her face, the curve of her tired shoulders. Then it hit him. It was his elementary school teacher. His breath caught in his throat. Mrs. Thompson had been one of the few teachers who had truly believed in him when he was just a shy, awkward boy with dreams bigger than his reality. She had always encouraged him, told him he had something special inside him, something worth nurturing. And now, decades later, here she was weak, struggling, and alone. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman flinched at first, but then turned to look at him. Her faded blue eyes searched his face for a long moment before widening in recognition. "Keanu," she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and emotion. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment as emotion swirled within him. She looked so different from the woman he remembered, thinner, frilier, as if life had taken more from her than it had given. What would happen, he finally managed to ask. Mrs. Thompson gave a tired sigh and settled down onto the pavement, motioning for Keanu to sit beside her. He did, ignoring the stares of passers-by. The city around them faded into the background as she began to speak. "Life is a way of turning on you when you least expect it," she said, her voice weary. "I was doing okay for a while, teaching, living in my small home, and then my health started to decline. Doctor visits turned into hospital stays. The bills piled up. I had to sell my home to cover costs. I thought I'd get better, but then my daughter—" Her voice cracked, and Keanu instinctively reached out, taking her frail hand in his. "She passed away after giving birth," she continued after a moment, her voice barely audible. "It was sudden. Complications. I wasn't ready to lose her. And then there was him." She gestured to the stroller, where the small child still slept. "My grandson. He had no one else. His father didn't want him, so I took him. But I'm not strong enough for this, Keanu. I am barely surviving." Keanu swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had seen suffering before. He had given to charities, donated millions, helped countless people in need. But this was different. This was personal. This was a woman who had once given him hope when he had needed it most. And now, it was his turn to do the same for her. He turned to look at her, his eyes determined. "You're not alone, Mrs. Thompson," he said firmly. "I'm going to help you. Both of you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she shook her head. "Keanu, I can't ask that of you." "You're not asking," he interrupted gently. "I'm offering." And with that, a new chapter began, one that would change all of their lives forever. Keanu Reeves helped Mrs. Thompson to her feet, his grip firm but gentle. He could feel how frail she had become, how each movement seemed to take a toll on her. The child in the stroller stirred slightly but remained asleep, blissfully unaware of the change that was about to unfold in his life. Keanu looked at the weary woman beside him and knew that she needed immediate help. He wasn't just going to offer words of comfort. He was going to take action. "Come with me," he said, his voice calm but determined. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, looking down at her tattered clothes and the old stroller that carried her grandson. She had spent so long relying only on herself, enduring hardship in silence, that accepting help felt almost foreign. But there was something in Keanu's gaze, something unwavering, something genuine, that made her nod at last. Keanu led them back to his car, opening the door and helping Mrs. Thompson settle into the passenger seat while he carefully secured the stroller and the baby in the back. As he drove, he made a few phone calls. He had friends in places that could provide immediate assistance: medical professionals, social workers, people who could make sure Mrs. Thompson and her grandson never had to suffer again. Their first stop was a private clinic. Keanu wanted her to get a full checkup to ensure that whatever health issues had taken away her strength could be managed or treated. The moment they walked into the pristine, well-lit facility, a team of doctors and nurses greeted them with warm smiles. "Mr. Reeves," one of the doctors said, extending a hand. "Everything is ready." Keanu nodded and turned to Mrs. Thompson. "You're in good hands now." The elderly woman, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances, could only squeeze his hand in silent gratitude before being led away for her examination. While she was being attended to, Keanu stayed close to the baby. He carefully lifted the child from the stroller and cradled him in his arms, feeling the tiny heartbeat against his chest. A sense of responsibility settled over him. This boy had already lost so much, but he would not be abandoned again. He deserved safety, care, and love. A few hours later, Mrs. Thompson emerged from the examination room. She looked exhausted but relieved. The doctors had diagnosed her with several conditions that, while serious, were manageable with the right treatment and care. Medication, rest, and proper nutrition would make a world of difference. Keanu took care of every bill without hesitation. "You don't have to do this," Mrs. Thompson murmured, but Keanu shook his head. "I want to." Their next stop was a temporary home. Keanu had arranged for a fully furnished apartment in a safe neighborhood, complete with all the essentials a grandmother and her grandchild would need. When Mrs. Thompson stepped inside, her hands trembled as she touched the soft couch, the clean kitchen counters, the neatly made bed. Tears filled her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Keanu placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You already did. A long time ago, when you believed in me." That night, for the first time in years, Mrs. Thompson slept in a warm bed with a full stomach, knowing that her grandson was safe beside her. And as Keanu left the apartment, he knew this was just the beginning. He wasn't going to stop at this one act of kindness. He was going to make sure that no child or elderly person had to endure what they had gone through. The next step would be something bigger, something that would change lives on a larger scale. Keanu Reeves sat in his car for a few minutes outside the apartment where Mrs. Thompson and her grandson now lived. He watched as the lights in the home flickered on, casting a warm glow against the cold night. He had done something good today, something real, but in his heart, he knew that this was just the beginning. Helping one person was a start, but what about all the others? How many more elderly people had been forgotten, abandoned by a system that failed them? How many children were left without a future, with no safety net to catch them when life took everything away? Keanu couldn't help but feel an overwhelming responsibility. He had the means to do something greater, and he was determined to make sure no one else had to endure what Mrs. Thompson had gone through. The next morning, he reached out to his network of philanthropists, community leaders, and professionals who specialize in social work and rehabilitation. He wasn't just looking to give temporary aid. He wanted to create a lasting solution. Within days, he had arranged meetings with experts in housing development, education reform, and healthcare access for underserved communities. His vision was clear. He wanted to build a foundation that would provide permanent housing, medical care, and educational resources for those in need. And Mrs. Thompson? She would be at the heart of it. When Keanu visited her the following week, she looked healthier already. With proper rest, food, and medication, her energy had returned. Her grandson was thriving in his new environment, laughing and playing in ways he hadn't before. She greeted Keanu warmly, offering him a seat in her modest but comfortable living room. "Keanu, I don't know how to repay you," she said, her hands folded on her lap. "You don't have to," Keanu replied with a gentle smile. "But I need your help with something." Mrs. Thompson looked at him curiously. "Anything. I want to start something bigger," Keanu said, leaning forward. "I want to build a community center, a place where people like you, people who have been left behind, can get the help they need. A safe haven, education, medical support, food security, job training. Everything. But I need someone who truly understands what these people go through. Someone who has lived it." Tears welled in her eyes as she realized what he was asking. "You want me to be part of this? I want you to lead it with me," Keanu said. "No one is better suited than you. You dedicated your life to teaching, to nurturing the minds of the young. This is just an extension of that." Mrs. Thompson wiped at her eyes, nodding as she gathered herself. "I would be honored." And so, the journey began. With Keanu's resources and connections, things moved fast. Within weeks, they had secured a building, a spacious facility that had once been a school but had fallen into disrepair. Volunteers gathered to clean it up, contractors worked on renovations, and donations poured in from those inspired by Keanu's efforts. News spread quickly. The media picked up on the story, and soon, people from all walks of life reached out, eager to help. Other celebrities joined the cause, offering funding and lending their voices to raise awareness. It became a movement, one that extended beyond just one building, evolving into a blueprint for community outreach across the country. Mrs. Thompson, despite her age, threw herself into the work with the same passion she had once brought to her classroom. She helped design programs, worked with educators, and mentored younger volunteers who wanted to make a difference. Keanu visited often, sometimes staying for hours to listen, to learn, and to ensure that everything ran as smoothly as possible. One day, as they stood outside watching children play in the courtyard, Mrs. Thompson turned to Keanu with a knowing smile. "You know," she said, "I always believed you would do something great. Even when you were a boy, there was something special about you. But this is beyond what I ever imagined." Keanu chuckled softly, shoving his hands in his pockets. "I think I just had a good teacher." Mrs. Thompson squeezed his arm. "And now, you're teaching the world what kindness really means." The community center officially opened its doors that summer. Hundreds of people attended the grand opening, including families who had already begun receiving help. There were speeches, celebrations, and above all, a renewed sense of hope. Keanu stood on stage beside Mrs. Thompson as she addressed the crowd, her voice strong and full of purpose. "This is not just a building," she said. "This is a promise that no one will be forgotten, that every child deserves a chance, that every elderly person deserves dignity, that no one has to suffer alone." As the crowd erupted into applause, Keanu looked around and saw the impact they had made. The real change wasn't just in brick and mortar, but in the hearts of the people who now had something they had lost long ago, a future. That night, as Keanu walked through the now bustling community center, he realized that this was only the beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. Keanu Reeves stood outside the newly opened community center, watching as families, children, and elderly individuals walked through its doors. It was a sight that filled him with pride and hope. The idea had started with a single act of kindness toward his former teacher, Mrs. Thompson, but had now evolved into something much bigger. What had begun as an attempt to change one life had now become a movement, touching countless people who had been struggling in silence. The days following the grand opening were filled with work. Keanu wasn't just a figurehead. He was fully involved in every aspect of the center's operation. He wanted to ensure that this wasn't just another charity project, but a truly self-sustaining system that could uplift those in need for generations to come. He spent his time talking to the staff, meeting with beneficiaries, and working closely with Mrs. Thompson, who had now become the heart of the organization. One of the first initiatives they launched was the Education and Career Assistance Program. Keanu knew that real change couldn't happen unless people were given the tools to help themselves. The program offered free tutoring for children, adult literacy classes, and vocational training to help people find stable employment. Mrs. Thompson, despite her age, was more involved than ever, mentoring young teachers and inspiring new volunteers. "I never thought I'd be back in a classroom," she said one afternoon, smiling as she helped a group of children with their reading. "But I guess some things never leave you." Keanu watched as she moved from one child to the next, her energy undiminished despite the hardships she had faced. He had given her a new home, but in reality, she had found her true home right here, among the people she was helping. But despite the success, challenges quickly arose. The demand for assistance grew every day, and soon the center was filled beyond capacity. Resources were stretched thin, and Keanu knew that they would need to expand sooner rather than later. He made a few calls to friends and fellow philanthropists, and within weeks, new partnerships were formed. With their help, Keanu secured funding to open 2 additional centers in different parts of the city, ensuring that more people could receive the help they desperately needed. However, Keanu was determined not to stop there. He wanted to create a model that could be replicated in other cities, other countries even. He started reaching out to governments and nonprofit organizations, sharing what they had learned and offering guidance on how to implement similar programs elsewhere. One evening, while going over plans with his team, Mrs. Thompson placed a hand on his shoulder. "Keanu, you've done something incredible here, but you need to take care of yourself too." Keanu smiled, appreciating her concern. "I know, but there's still so much to do." She nodded knowingly. "And you'll do it. But don't forget, you can't save the world alone. What you've started will continue, even when you step back for a moment." Her words stuck with him. For months, he had thrown himself into the project, rarely taking a break. He realized that while he had built something lasting, he needed to trust in the people who were helping him carry the mission forward. Over the next few months, Keanu focused on solidifying leadership within the organization. He assembled a dedicated team to oversee operations, ensuring that the work would continue even if he wasn't there every day. He watched with pride as Mrs. Thompson took on a greater leadership role, inspiring a new generation of educators and volunteers. On the anniversary of the community center's founding, Keanu stood before a crowd of supporters, volunteers, and beneficiaries. He looked out at the faces of those whose lives had been changed and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "This started as an act of gratitude," he said. "But what I've learned is that kindness has a way of multiplying. When you give someone hope, they pass it on to others. And that's how we change the world. Not in a single moment, but in the millions of small, compassionate acts that come after." As the applause erupted around him, Keanu knew that the journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, still lives to touch, still hope to spread. But for the first time in a long time, he also knew that he wasn't carrying the burden alone. And that made all the difference. Keanu Reeves sat in a quiet corner of the community center, watching the children run around the play area while volunteers handed out meals to those in need. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence and struggle that had once dominated these people's lives. He took a deep breath, feeling both a sense of peace and the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest. It had been over a year since the first center had opened, and now, with multiple locations spread across the city, their work was making an undeniable impact. Families were getting the support they needed, children were learning in safe environments, and elderly individuals like Mrs. Thompson were regaining their dignity. But Keanu knew that success was not an endpoint. It was a stepping stone to something even greater. One afternoon, as he walked through the halls of the center, he found Mrs. Thompson in a classroom, surrounded by eager young students. Her energy remained as strong as ever, and the way she engaged with the children was nothing short of inspiring. She caught sight of him and smiled, gesturing for him to come in. "You're just in time," she said. "I was telling them about how important it is to believe in their dreams." Keanu sat down among the children, nodding in agreement. "That's true. Dreams are powerful, but dreams need action too. If you believe in something strongly enough, you have to work for it." One of the children, a boy named Luis, raised his hand. "Mr. Reeves, did you ever have a dream that you thought you couldn't reach?" Keanu chuckled softly, thinking back to his own childhood. "Oh, many times," he admitted. "When I was young, I wanted to be an actor, but I was shy and I didn't think I was good enough. There were times I almost gave up." "But you didn't," Louise pointed out. So what changed? Keanu leaned forward, meeting the boy's gaze. Someone believed in me, he said. Someone told me that I had something special inside me, even when I didn't see it myself. And sometimes, that's all we need, someone to remind us that we're capable of more than we think. Mrs. Thompson placed a gentle hand on Keanu's shoulder, her eyes filled with warmth. That's what we're trying to do here, she said. Give these children a reason to believe. Later that evening, Keanu met with his team to discuss the next phase of the initiative. Expanding in one city had been challenging, but now they wanted to take the program nationwide. They needed funding, partnerships, and more dedicated individuals willing to carry on the mission. Keanu reached out to friends in the entertainment industry, philanthropists, and business leaders. Many were inspired by what had been accomplished and wanted to contribute. Within months, they had secured the resources to launch new centers in 5 more cities. As construction began on these new sites, Keanu traveled from city to city, ensuring that everything was moving according to plan. At each stop, he met people whose lives had been transformed by the community centers. He heard stories of single mothers who had found stable jobs, teenagers who had gone back to school, and elderly individuals who now had a place to call home. But amid all the success, he remained grounded. Mrs. Thompson continued to be his guiding light, reminding him that true change was about people, not numbers. She often sent him handwritten letters, filled with updates about the children and heartfelt words of encouragement. One day, Keanu received news that brought both sorrow and gratitude. Mrs. Thompson had passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had lived her final years surrounded by love, doing what she cherished most. At her memorial, Keanu stood before a gathering of students, teachers, and community members, sharing what she had meant to him. She taught me the power of kindness, he said, and she showed me that one act of belief can change a person's life forever. This center, this mission, it all exists because she believed in me once. And now, it's our turn to believe in others. The loss of Mrs. Thompson left a void, but her legacy endured in the thousands of lives she had touched. Keanu made a vow to keep her spirit alive, dedicating a section of each community center in her honor. The classrooms were named after her, and a scholarship fund was established to help young students pursue higher education. As the years passed, the initiative continued to grow, spreading to more cities and even other countries. Keanu never sought recognition for his efforts. His reward was in the smiles of those who had found hope again. One evening, as he walked through the original center, now bustling with life, he stopped in front of a mural painted on the wall. It was an image of Mrs. Thompson, surrounded by children, her hands holding an open book. Below it were the words, "Believe in someone, and they will learn to believe in themselves." Keanu smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He had set out to help one person, but in doing so, he had helped thousands. And he knew, without a doubt, that Mrs. Thompson would be proud.